worst game ever. Are you tired of hearing this phrase or others like it? I know I am. One of the problems with social media discourse is its tendency to obliterate any kind of nuance, to the point where a piece of media is either a flawless masterpiece or a steaming pile devoid of all redeemable qualities. But in many cases, a much maligned video game isn't nearly the unplayable trash that the internet makes it out to be. Case in point, Quest 64. It's a story that most of you will be familiar with. Nintendo's entry into the fifth generation of video game consoles was the Nintendo 64, and the biggest controversy surrounding the console was its use of cartridge-based ROMs as opposed to the compact disc format favored by its competitor, the PlayStation. Now, cartridges had a number of advantages, such as near instantaneous loading times and the lack of any moving parts in the console itself, which meant increased reliability. More importantly for Nintendo, however, cartridges were harder to pirate and allowed the company to maintain strict control over its hardware ecosystem. On the other hand, cartridges had far less storage capacity than CD-ROMs and were also more expensive to manufacture. So if you were a developer focusing on big, expansive games, such as RPGs, then the N64 wasn't looking terribly attractive as a platform, which explains why the RPG genre is so poorly represented there. But it wasn't entirely unrepresented. You had the Paper Mario series, Ogre Battle 64, Iden Chronicles The First Mage, and the subject of this video, Quest 64. Now, this game does not have a very good reputation, to put it mildly. It's not quite on the level of Superman 64, but if you read any list of worst N64 games, then there's a good chance that Quest 64 will be on it. Even Nintendo Power couldn't find much good to say about it, with one of their reviewers stating that it's more like a trip to the dentist than a quest, and their strategy guide for the game opens by saying that experienced role players won't find much in Quest 64 to sink their broadswords into. How bad must the game be when even Nintendo's own magazine can't find anything good to say about it? Well, I'm here to say that Quest 64 isn't quite the travesty people make it out to be. The game was developed by Imagineer, a Japanese company whose biggest claim to fame was making console ports of American and European titles, such as Elite, SimCity, and Populous. Quest 64 first appeared at Nintendo's Space World trade show in 1997, where it was tentatively titled Eletale, and described as the N64's first full-fledged, full-polygon RPG where every action leads to growth. Interestingly, the site says that the protagonist was initially named Jean-Jacques, and in the March 1998 issue of Nintendo Power, the preview for Quest 64 simply calls him Jack. The game would later come to be called Eletale Monsters in Japan and Holy Magic Century in Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. For North Americans, however, it was simply titled Quest 64. I mean, really? Of all the names they could have given it, Quest 64 was the best they could come up with? The only way that title could be more generic was if it were something like Nintendo 64 Role-Playing Game 64. Right from the start, it was up against some stiff competition, as just over a year earlier, Square had released Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation. Those of you who weren't around for that game's release, God, I'm old, might not appreciate what an absolute juggernaut it was. I wasn't going to see any of it, of course, on account of owning an N64 instead of a PlayStation, and at the time I had no interest in RPGs, so I never played Quest 64 either. So believe me when I say that I'm approaching this game without having any sort of nostalgic attachment to it. Quest 64 takes place in a Celtic-inspired world called, not surprisingly, Celtland, which since time immemorial has been guarded by spirit tamers, who gain magical abilities through pacts with the spirits of nature. So if you're a D&D player, imagine something like a warlock with a few levels of druid. The secrets of the spirit tamers were kept in a tome called the Eletale book, which only spirit tamers were permitted to read. In the past, the misuse of the book had caused a cataclysm known as the Day of Grief, so naturally it was kept under close guard. But one day, an evil being stole the Eletale book and used it to wreak havoc across the land, and so a spirit tamer named Lord Bartholomew set out to retrieve it. When he fails to return, however, it falls to his son, an apprentice spirit tamer named Brian, to find the book and prevent a second day of grief from happening. The game begins with Brian inside the Melroad Monastery, where the abbot fills him in on the game's backstory. And no, I have no idea what this mass of pixels and polygons is supposed to represent. It's actually an old man with a long white beard, but you'd never guess that from looking at him. And if you're curious as to why Brian has a piece of hair sticking up, I learned, during the course of making this video, that this is a common visual motif in Japanese media. It's called a hoge, literally fool hair, and is typically used to indicate that someone is naive, foolish, or a bit airheaded. From there, our rather adorable protagonist heads down to the city of Melroad. And since this is an RPG, your first goal might be to buy some equipment and recruit some additional party members. Except you won't be, as Quest 64 has no party members and no equipment system. Brian wields a staff, and that's the only weapon you're going to get. There is a basic roster of items that you can use to heal yourself or restore magic points and whatnot, but you can't actually buy any of these things because there is no money and no real stores. Instead, NPCs will simply give them to you if you talk to them, and on very rare occasions, you will find them after defeating enemies. You can stop at a nearby inn, where Brian meets a woman named Shannon, who looks a bit like Ivy from Soul Calibur. The purpose of inns is to save your game, and oddly enough, Quest 64 requires the use of the N64 controller pack to save your progress. This was a 32KB memory card that plugged into the controller, and the idea was that players could use it to exchange data, or store things that were too large to record on the cartridge's battery-backed save RAM, such as ghost data in Mario Kart 64. But I have no idea why Quest 64 requires it, because if you open the save files in a hex editor, you'll find that the game isn't using anywhere near 32KB worth of data. After leaving town, you'll find yourself pulled into combat and discover that Quest 64 has a rather unique system of battle, which is a combination of real-time and turn-based combat. Brian is surrounded by a white circle, which indicates how far he can move during his turn. There is another white circle further out, which indicates how far you have to go to escape combat. During battle, Brian can cast a spell based on one of the four elements, earth, wind, water, and fire, which are mapped to the four C buttons. Alternatively, he can simply walk up to the nearest foe and give them a good solid whack with his staff. You'll often face off against multiple enemies at once, but mercifully, only one of them will attack during the enemy's turn. And when the enemy attacks, you can actually move Brian around to try and avoid their attacks. This is easier said than done, however, as Brian's range of movement is rather small and many attacks will home in on him, but this mid-combat dodging is key to surviving some of the more difficult encounters. Brian is defined by four main stats: agility, defense, hit points, and magic points. Agility increases the accuracy of your attacks, your ability to dodge attacks, who goes first in battle, and how far you can move in one turn. Defense reduces the amount of damage you take, and hit points and magic points should be self-explanatory. What makes Quest 64 different from other RPGs of this era is that there is no traditional XP and leveling system. Instead, Brian's four stats improve by performing various actions. Agility is increased simply by running around, both in and out of battle. Defense is increased by taking hits in combat. Your maximum hit points is increased by hitting enemies with your staff, as well as taking hits from enemies. Lastly, your maximum MP is increased by successfully hitting enemies with your spells. Your four elemental schools of magic can also be leveled up, going from 1 to 50, and higher levels will make your spells more effective, in addition to unlocking new spells. There are two ways to level up your magic. One is by simply winning enough battles, at which point the game will give you the ability to increase one of the four elements. The other way is by finding spirits within the world. These appear as these little white wisps, and when Brian gets near them, a question mark will appear over his head. At that point, you simply press the A or Z button, and you can choose which element to level up. This is what that Space World preview meant when they said that all actions lead to growth. Or at least, that's what the intention was. In practice, the agility stat levels up incredibly slowly, to the point where you'll never get it anywhere near the maximum in a single playthrough. I wonder how many kids simply tape the control stick to the side and let the game run overnight just to max out their agility stat. Once you've done everything there is to do in Melroad, which isn't much, Brian sets out on his father's trail, which will eventually take him to the city of Dondoran. I should point out that Quest 64's localization has a few rough patches. The area we're in is called Holy Plan according to the map, but it's clearly supposed to be Holy Plain. Likewise, Connor Fortress was probably intended to be Connor Forest, judging by the fact that it's a woodland with no fortress in sight. It's out in the field that some of the game's weaknesses become apparent. First of all, the rate of random encounters is much too high, to the point where you'll finish a battle only to be dragged into another mere seconds afterwards. It's not so bad at the beginning of the game, where the enemies are weak and you need the extra experience to raise your stats, but towards the end of the game, you'll start encountering foes at every turn who can easily overpower you, and it's simply too much of a bother to waste time fighting them. Another issue is the camera. It will take every opportunity it can to circle around Brian, and the only control you have over it is pressing the B button, which will move it behind him. The result is that it becomes very easy to become turned around, especially after a battle. Now, the developers must have anticipated this, because after winning an encounter, the game will orient Brian in the direction he was facing when battle began. The problem is, the game doesn't do this if you simply ran away from a fight, and near the end, I was running from nearly every fight there was. You do have a compass which shows you which direction you're going, but it disappears during combat, so you'll have to remember which way you are facing whenever a random encounter begins. This isn't much of an issue on the overworld, as you have a map to tell you where you are, but it becomes a major problem in dungeons and other areas not covered by the map. Most of the locations you'll visit in Quest 64 are visually nondescript, with little in the way of landmarks or signposts, and the result is that, while most dungeons are linear point A to point B affairs, it's still extremely easy to get turned around. This becomes a massive headache on account of the absurd rate of random encounters, as it will result in you being pulled into battle after battle after battle, and you will soon grow to dread hearing the combat music. Some areas will have signposts which show you which way to go, but for some inexplicable reason, they are completely illegible and don't serve any apparent purpose. Eventually, you'll reach the city of Dondoran, where we can find Shannon conveniently waiting for us at the inn, and after speaking with the king, you'll learn that a thief made off with something called the Earth Orb, and is using it to cause trouble, so naturally we need to stop him. The game doesn't do a very good job of explaining this, but there are 4 elemental orbs you need to recover, and the first one is located in a forest to the south. As we explore the castle, we meet the king's daughter, Princess Flora, and everything about her suggests that she would be a party member, but she isn't. We head south to Connor Forest, and here's where we first start running into the navigation issues I mentioned earlier. The place is dark and so visually nondescript that it's hard to get your bearings, and on top of that, you have the incessant random encounters that will sap your HP, your MP, and your patience. One problem I quickly noticed during combat is that you have no targeting indicators for any of your spells, which means you simply have to remember their area of effect. For example, there is an earth spell that will send a boulder rolling through your foes, potentially hitting several of them, but doing so requires that you place Brian in a very specific spot, otherwise it might end up hitting nothing at all. Eventually, we reach the boss, Solvering. Many games have what I like to call the get good moment, where it takes off the training wheels and tests you on whether you've mastered its mechanics. And the fight against Solvering is Quest 64's get good moment. Like most bosses in the game, he has 2 attacks, one ranged and one used if you get too close to him. At range, Solvering will fire this flaming beam at you, which you can dodge, but if you get too close, he'll use this area of effect earth spell, which you cannot evade. This battle was particularly painful as I had been focusing on earth, which Solvering is resistant to. Of course, should Brian fall in battle, he'll simply be teleported back to the nearest inn, with all of his items and stat gains intact. This is not quite as merciful as it sounds, however, because you'll still have to hike all the way back to the boss, which means, you guessed it, more random encounters. This is where having healing magic available is essential, because while it doesn't heal enough hit points to be useful in battle, it will allow you to heal up after a fight, which is made easy because Brian will recover MP simply by moving around. we triumph over Solvaring, and with the Earth Orb in hand, we start off towards our next destination, Larapool, also known as the Water Capital. To reach it, we'll have to take a boat, and the captain says that Brian bears a striking resemblance to someone who passed this way earlier, which can only mean that it was Brian's father. Unfortunately, we don't get very far before the wind stops blowing, and what's worse, the water from the lake is flowing in the wrong direction. So off we go to Larapool to see what all the fuss is about, and I want to remark on just how empty the world of Celtland can feel at times. Quest 64 isn't a bad-looking game, and it features an impressive draw distance for the N64, but its world certainly feels lifeless at times. And given the frequency of random encounters with monsters, it paints a picture of a society on the brink of collapse. We reach the city of Larapool, and once again we find Shannon waiting for us in the local inn. Why, it's almost as if she knows more than she's letting on or something. After barging into rooms uninvited, we meet a sorceress named Layla, who tells us that whatever has caused the wind to stop blowing can be found in the city of Wind, Normoon, which is our next destination. To reach it, however, we have to go through an area known as Cull Hazard, which is the first proper dungeon in this game. I use the term dungeon loosely here because it's really just a linear, nondescript cave with a truly horrendous rate of random encounters. If you're particularly unlucky, you'll stumble across a wyvern, a large, fire-breathing dragon who can easily kick your ass. Fortunately for us, we've learned one of the most devastating spells in the game, Avalanche, which drops a rain of boulders upon your enemies. If one of them should get hit by multiple boulders, they can end up taking a few hundred hit points worth of damage, which makes it one of the best crowd control spells available. Of course, it's entirely possible that none of the boulders will end up hitting anything, so using it's a bit of a high-risk, high-reward strategy. Something odd about this area is that near the end, you'll suddenly end up following a large green beanstalk as it snakes its way through the cavern and eventually brings you to an open platform. It feels like something that should have culminated in a boss fight or something, but there's nothing here except a treasure chest. We then reach the city of Normoon, and according to the townsfolk, the nearby Windward Forest is home to something called the Windjade, which someone stole and is now using to wreak havoc. After stealing everything that's not nailed down, we head off to the local tavern, where, surprise, surprise, we meet Shannon once again. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get suspicious of this woman. Upstairs, we meet an NPC named Leonardo, and much like Princess Flora, he feels very much like someone who was intended to be a party member. In case you haven't noticed by now, Quest 64 has all the hallmarks of a game that simply wasn't finished. As I mentioned earlier, so much of the world feels strangely empty, and there are a large number of buildings and rooms that are just completely deserted. Brian fights his way through hordes of orcs and giant spiders, and eventually stumbles across the one who stole the Windjade, a sorcerer named Zels. He can huff and puff all he wants, but he can't withstand the pummeling barrage of rocks we drop on his head, and he soon crumbles. We talk to Layla back in town, who says that the wind is once again blowing thanks to us. She then tells us that she is also the messenger for someone named Epona. No, not that one. Epona is evidently a seer of some sort, and she wishes to speak with us. To get to her, Layla will lower the water level in Larapool, which will allow us to enter the Blue Cave, which will eventually lead us to Epona. I say eventually because the Blue Cave is long, monotonous, and packed to the gunnels with random encounters. Fortunately, the School of Earth Magic has now provided us with one of the most overpowered spells in the game, Magic Barrier. This makes Brian completely immune to magic attacks for 3 turns, and considering that 99% of the attacks you will face in this game are magic attacks, this allows you to trivialize even the toughest encounters. It's not 100% reliable, however, as sometimes you can miss when casting it on yourself, and I have to admit that I've never played an RPG before where buff spells can miss. If you have the patience to make it all the way through this gauntlet of enemies, you'll reach a place called Crystal Valley where Epona resides. She gives us some backstory on the Eletale book, saying that it must never be opened, for if someone does, then it will be the end of all we know, which makes me wonder why it even exists in the first place. Then she tells us to use a teleporter in the next room to warp to the Isle of Skye, where we can find the Stone of Water Spirit, or the Water Jewel as it's called. we are magically transported onto a ship, which just so happens to be docked at the Isle of Skye. A sorceress named Colleen tells us that someone has stolen the water jewel and is using it to wreak havoc, so off we go to stop them. It turns out that the one responsible for the theft is someone named Nepti, and once again we have another boss fight. The combination of magic barrier and avalanche makes the battle a breeze, and soon the water jewel is in our hands. With 3 MacGuffins down and 1 to go, our journey then takes us to East Limelin. We head to Limelin City and have another run-in with Shannon, who remarks that it's strange that people build cities to last thousands of years despite a human lifespan being so much briefer, which isn't foreshadowing anything at all, no sir. We visit the castle, home to the Queen Diana, and its Rococo aesthetic makes it one of the more visually appealing locations in the game. The Queen asks if we have come to save them from a fire starter named Fargo, and says that if we want to find our father, then we'll have to deal with him first. To get to him, however, we'll have to travel through an abandoned mine called Barragoon Tunnel, which is yet another linear, nondescript cavern filled with random encounters, some of which are extremely nasty. These will-o'-the-wisps have fire attacks that will do loads of damage, so you're better off just running from them. In fact, that's really what the last third of this game is. Run from a battle, get pulled into another battle a few seconds later, and repeat a few dozen times until the end. We then run into a buxom redhead named Shilf, who says she's a servant of someone or something called Mammon, whose return she has been waiting 1,000 years for. This is yet another boss fight, one with absolutely no build-up or explanation, but the usual strategy still applies. Cast Magic Barrier, and then cast Avalanche. There is still no sign of Fargo, however, and we soon find ourselves in a desert area named Dindom Dries. According to the inhabitants of the nearby Greenock village, it used to be green and vibrant, and Shannon tells us that King Bagis of Brannock Castle somehow managed to get his hands on incredible magic powers, and he burnt the city to the ground for no other reason than to test his abilities. Looking at the map, you'll notice a large empty area to the southeast, and if you're willing to cross the barren wasteland and endure God knows how many random encounters, you'll reach the lost city of Shamwood. Getting serious Sam flashbacks all of a sudden, we head into the Lost City, and we stumble across someone named Lavar, who once held the Eletale book in his hands. He was not worthy of its powers, however, and caused nothing but ruin. Epona eventually freed him from the book's influence, but as penance he has been forced to remain here until an evil being called Mammon is destroyed, the second time we've heard that name. There's also a load of treasure to be had, which we steal for ourselves. Brian may be young, but he's well versed in the ways of the RPG protagonist. We still have one last magical gem to retrieve, however, and to find it, we need to find Fargo, who is hiding out in a volcanic area known as the Boil Hole. As you can probably guess by now, it's a long, linear cave filled with a stupendous amount of random encounters that you are better off running from. Eventually, we reach Fargo, who uses fire-based attacks, but the power of the magic barrier protects us from harm, and like all those who stood against Brian before, we bury him under a pile of rocks. We emerge from the Boil Hole into Barragoon Moor, a dreary, depressing place ruled over by the tyrannical King Bagis. Shannon awaits us at the local inn, and she tells us that Bagis has rounded up and imprisoned all who opposed him, and it's possible that Brian's father was among them. So off we go to Brannock Castle. The front gates are barred, but there is a convenient back door that will get us inside. Bagis has an ogreish henchman named Guilty, who says that he's been using us to experiment, whatever that means. We don't get a chance to hear him elaborate on the matter as a fight ensues. Look, you already know how this is going to play out, alright? Cast Magic Barrier and then drop a bunch of rocks on him. It never fails. As we ascend the castle, we encounter Leonardo, who says that he came here to rescue Brian's father, but failed in the attempt. Climbing even higher, we at last find Lord Bartholomew. But what's this? He is wounded, and Shannon is standing over him. Brian's father explains that she is but a puppet of Mammon, but oddly enough, she doesn't seem to hold any actual malice towards Brian. At the end of our journey, we at last find King Bagis, who is easily the toughest fight thus far. That is, unless you've been hoarding items and have both Magical Barrier and Avalanche at your command. Once he's dealt with, we have another conversation with Shannon, who tells us that the 4 orbs we've acquired are the keys to the realm where Mammon awaits. Just whose side is this woman on, anyway? Is this moral ambiguity in my Quest 64? It turns out that she is merely an artificial human created by Mammon to lead Brian to him so that he could be freed. The realm of Mammon is a chaotic location consisting of walkways floating in the void and empty, distorted versions of the locations we've visited before, including the town of Melroad. Soon we reach the final boss himself, Mammon. In Hebrew, the word mammon simply means money or wealth, and in the Bible it's typically associated with greed, such as in the saying that one cannot serve both God and mammon. In the Middle Ages, Mammon was often personified as a demon of wealth and greed, but there's no real hint of that in this game. Mammon might seem threatening, but once again the twin combo of Avalanche and Magic Barrier makes this fight strikingly anticlimactic. In fact, because Mammon is so large, Avalanche is even more effective as more of the boulders will hit him. After vanquishing the terrible demon, Shannon appears again and expresses confusion that she's still around after Mammon's demise, and that she's going to travel the world in order to learn what it means to be human. Then we have a brief text crawl telling us how peace returned to Keltland, and then we roll credits. Wait, what happened to Brian's father? That was the whole impetus for our quest, wasn't it? Did he survive? Who knows? It should not come as a surprise to learn that Quest 64 did not set the world on fire. Review scores from critics were generally mixed, and the game failed to put so much as a dent in the juggernaut that was Final Fantasy VII. But it must have sold decent numbers, as Imagineer began work on a sequel. Unfortunately, the company ran into financial troubles and cancelled the project early in development, so what little we know comes from a German magazine called Nintendo Funvision. According to the article, titled Swift Follow-Up, the game would be set 100 years after Brian's lifetime, and take place in a world inspired by the Byzantine Empire. It would feature 2 protagonists, Leon, a spirit tamer, and Sophia, a swordswoman, and at some point the player would be able to choose which of the 2 protagonists they wanted to play as. A game with a guy named Leon, and the ability to choose between 2 protagonists. Where have I seen that before? As I mentioned at the start of this video, Quest 64 is not a game with a very good reputation, occasionally making its way onto the lists of worst N64 games churned out by various content mills. And look, I'm not going to claim that it's some underrated masterpiece of the RPG genre. If you grew up playing 16-bit RPGs like Chrono Trigger or Secret of Mana, and you expected something similar with Quest 64, then you were likely rather disappointed. But neither is this game the unplayable trash some people make it out to be. Really, I think the worst thing about Quest 64 is that it was almost certainly rushed to market. If you look at the preview in the March 1998 issue of Nintendo Power, it says that, with the success of WCW vs NWO World Tour, THQ has learned that patience pays off, and they aren't pushing Imagineer to finish Quest 64 before its time. Well, obviously they did, because it goes on to mention 2 party members that they have yet to add, and if I had to guess, those were likely Leonardo and Princess Flora. If the developers had been given enough time to finish the game and make the world feel a little more alive, then Quest 64 could have been a solid RPG for a console that desperately needed one. But the question remains, why does this game have such a bad reputation? First of all, we need to remember the context of Quest 64's release. N64 owners were starved for RPGs, which was all the more painful considering that the Super NES had no end to them. There were a lot of expectations riding on Imagineer's effort, so when the game turned out to be mediocre, it's easy to see how the response would have been more negative than it would have otherwise been. On top of that, I think a good portion of the hatred is simply the result of the bandwagon effect, where people adopt certain attitudes or beliefs simply because others share those attitudes and beliefs. No one wants to be thought of as having poor taste, and we live in an era where there are simply too many games for us to play and evaluate them all. So if everyone says that a game sucks, most people will take them at their word, even if they've never played it. But that poor opinion has to originate somewhere, And if you do a search for Quest 64 on YouTube, the very first result is this video by Pro Jared, which was published in July of 2012 and has received around 3.5 million views. His review of Quest 64 was decidedly negative, and I can't help but wonder how many people got their impression of the game from this video, which is then repeated across the internet until it became treated as gospel. I'm reminded of one Far Side comic strip, which showed a video store in hell that is stocked with nothing but copies of Ishtar, a 1987 comedy film starring Dustin Hoffman and Warren Beatty. I had never seen the film, but I figured that it must have been rather terrible. Well, as it turns out, Gary Larson hadn't seen the film either when he drew that strip, and he was simply going off the common perception that it was a cinematic failure. Years later, when he saw the film on an airplane, he actually found it rather entertaining. And there is a lot of entertainment out there that was widely panned, but which I genuinely enjoyed. For example, 90s video game movies like Super Mario Bros., Mortal Kombat, and Street Fighter were savaged by critics and audiences alike, but I will go to bat for every one of them. And when it comes to Quest 64, I imagine a lot of people have a great deal of nostalgic attachment to this game. I'm no stranger to corporations pandering to my nostalgia, but it only ever involves the really big franchises that are still popular today. I mean, anyone can say something like, "Hey, do you remember Transformers?" Well, of course, it's only one of the biggest toy franchises on the planet. And speaking of cartoons from the 80s and 90s, anyone can mention something like Animaniacs or Tiny Toon Adventures. But what about the shows that are lesser known because they never got popular, got cancelled after a dozen episodes, or only aired in one country? How many people remember shows like Ovid Video, The Smoggies, Captain Star, or Bucky O'Hare? And the same is true of video games. Back in the day, unless you were spoiled or had rich parents, actually getting to own a game was a rare privilege, typically reserved for birthdays and Christmas. Instead, you'd rent them for the weekend, but sometimes the video store wouldn't have any copies of the game you really wanted to play, so you wound up taking home something else instead. And there is a whole category of games that I only played as rentals, but which I still remember fondly. If you want to wax nostalgic about something, then don't tell me about the big franchises that everyone knows, but tell me about something that might not be as well known, but which has personal significance for you. All that said, it's difficult to recommend Quest 64 to anyone wanting to explore the N64's library of games. It's not as bad as people make it out to be, but the empty environments and repetitive encounters can really make it a slog at times. Still, there are worse RPGs on the N64. Much, much worse.